For 68 years, Margaret Hill had built her life brick by brick, first with her husband, then alone after his passing. Her house wasn't just wood and nails. It was her history, her sacrifices, her love. But that fortress was about to be attacked from the place she least expected, her own daughter. One morning, a letter arrived. Not a warm note or a family photo, but a lawsuit. Her daughter claimed she was no longer capable of caring for herself and wanted control of the house. What Linda didn't know was that Margaret was far from helpless. Behind the wrinkles was a mind sharp as ever, and a plan to expose the truth. What followed would be a storm of betrayal, courtroom drama, and shocking twists that no one, not even her family, could see coming. Margaret Hill woke before sunrise, just as she had every day for decades. At 68, the world expected her to slow down, to linger in bed, to let the hours drift by. But Margaret was not like the world expected. Her body, still disciplined from years of hard work, stirred at the first hint of morning light. She slid out of bed, her knees reminding her of every year she had lived, and padded softly across the polished wooden floor. This house was more than a home. It was a living monument. Every beam, every nail, every brick bore the memory of the years she and her late husband, Robert, had poured into it. They had built it from the ground up, one summer long ago, with sweat on their brows and laughter in their hearts. The walls weren't just painted, they were seasoned with love, arguments, reconciliations, and dreams that had somehow survived the test of time. Now, the roses in the garden were her quiet companions. Robert had planted them for her on their 20th anniversary. Every spring they burst into bloom, fiery red and soft blush, the way his love had always been. Passionate, yet gentle. Margaret tended them daily, pruning away what was dead so the rest could live. It was almost poetic. On this particular morning, the air was calm, fragrant with dew and roses. She poured herself tea and stepped out onto the back porch, her old wicker chair creaking a little as she sat. Across the fence, Susan Miller, her neighbor and closest friend, waved a greeting. "You're up early again," Susan called, her gray hair tied back neatly, a gardening hat perched on her head. Margaret smiled. "Habit dies hard. Besides, the roses won't wait for me to sleep in." Susan chuckled and came closer to the fence. "They're looking beautiful this year, just like Robert would have liked." Margaret's smile softened. "He'd probably tell me I'm pruning them wrong." The two women shared an easy laugh, the kind that only comes from years of shared memories. Susan had been there through birthdays, funerals, and everything in between. There was a comfort in knowing some things didn't change, but that comfort was about to be tested. A silver sedan rolled up the driveway, its engine purring too smoothly for the quiet neighborhood. Margaret's eyes narrowed just slightly as she set down her teacup. Linda, her daughter, stepped out, dressed impeccably in a fitted blazer. Beside her, Greg emerged, his suit crisp, his smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Mom!" Linda's voice carried a practiced warmth as she approached, arms open for a hug. Margaret stood, accepting the embrace, though she felt the stiffness in her daughter's frame. "Linda! Greg!" What a surprise. Greg shook her hand firmly. "Margaret, you look as strong as ever. House is looking great too." His gaze swept across the porch, lingering on the details of the property in a way that made Margaret's stomach tighten. They settled into the living room, where the familiar smell of cedarwood mixed with the faint scent of Linda's perfume. It was almost too sweet, nothing like the lavender Robert had loved. Greg glanced around, his eyes catching on the crown moldings, the antique furniture, the high ceilings. "This place, it's really something. You just don't see craftsmanship like this anymore." Linda perched on the edge of the couch, leaning forward with that smile Margaret knew too well, the one she used when trying to gently push an agenda. "Mom, Greg and I were talking. We worry about you here, alone. This house is so big, and the stairs—" Margaret arched an eyebrow. "The stairs haven't changed since you were a kid running up and down them 2 at a time." Linda let out a soft laugh, but there was tension beneath it. "Things are different now. What if you fall? And the upkeep? It's a lot for one person. We've been thinking maybe it's time to consider options that would make life easier for you, somewhere with no stairs, no maintenance, somewhere safe." Margaret sipped her tea, letting the silence speak before she answered. "You mean selling the house?" Greg's smile didn't falter. "It's just, the market is incredible right now. You could get a fantastic price, move somewhere comfortable, and have more than enough to enjoy your retirement without worrying about repairs or property taxes." Margaret's voice was calm, but her eyes were steel. "This isn't just a house, Greg. It's my life. And I'm not ready to give it up because the market is hot." Linda's smile tightened. "Mom, no one's trying to take anything from you. We're just concerned. You've done so much for this family. Let us do something for you now." Margaret set her cup down carefully. "By taking my home away." The room went quiet. The ticking of the old grandfather clock filled the space between them. Greg cleared his throat, his charm flickering just slightly. "We just want what's best for you, Margaret. That's all." Margaret stood, signaling the conversation was over. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm staying here. End of discussion." Linda rose slowly, smoothing her blazer. "We'll talk about it another time." Margaret walked them to the door, her back straight, her resolve unshaken. As Linda slid into the passenger seat, Greg paused, his hand on the car door. He looked back at the house, and for just a moment, his eyes gleamed, not with affection, but with calculation. The silver sedan backed out of the driveway, its polished exterior catching the sunlight. Margaret stood at the doorway, the quiet of the house settling around her again. But something about that quiet felt different now, less like peace, more like the pause before a storm. She closed the door slowly, her mind lingering on Greg's glance, and she knew deep down that this wouldn't be the last conversation about her house. The afternoon sun slanted through the lace curtains, casting familiar patterns across the living room floor. Margaret settled back into her chair, the one Robert had refinished years ago, and let her mind wander. She tried not to, but Linda's visit had stirred too many old thoughts. Her eyes drifted toward the framed photographs on the mantel. There was Linda at age 6, standing in front of the half-built house with a gap-toothed smile, her hair in braids. Robert had been holding her hand, his other hand resting proudly on the foundation they had poured themselves. It hadn't been easy. Every brick in these walls had cost them something. Hours of labor, skipped vacations, sleepless nights. Robert worked extra shifts. Margaret took on part-time bookkeeping jobs, sometimes late into the night, just to make ends meet. And every dollar that wasn't used for the house went toward Linda's future. School clothes, college tuition, the kind of opportunities Margaret had only dreamed of at that age. She remembered Linda's first day at university, how proud she'd felt sending her daughter off with brand new luggage and a heart full of hope. Back then, she thought the sacrifices would come back around in the form of gratitude, maybe a phone call now and then just to say, "Thanks." But life rarely paid back in the way you imagined. A sharp knock at the back door broke her reverie. Susan's voice floated in, calm but carrying a certain edge. "Margaret? You busy?" Margaret opened the door to find Susan holding a basket of fresh muffins. thought you could use these. And maybe some company." They sat at the kitchen table, the aroma of blueberries filling the air. Susan's sharp blue eyes studied her friend carefully. "So, your daughter stopped by." Margaret gave a dry laugh. "Was it that obvious?" "You mean the silver sedan parked out front? The one Greg polishes like a trophy? Hard to miss." Margaret sipped her tea. "They were concerned about me living here alone." Susan raised an eyebrow. "Concerned. Right. Concerned enough to bring up selling the house?" Margaret's silence was enough of an answer. Susan leaned forward. "Margaret, I don't want to meddle, but I know people. I've seen Greg's type in my years at the school board. Charming smile, always talking about what's best for someone. And somehow it always ends up benefiting them the most. You need to be careful." Margaret smiled faintly. "You think I don't know when someone's circling my house like a hawk? But thank you. I'll keep my eyes open." The conversation shifted to lighter topics. The book club Susan still attended, the upcoming church fair. But Margaret felt the undercurrent of her friend's warning long after Susan left. That evening, seeking a distraction, she decided to tidy the storage room in the back of the house. It had been months since she'd gone through the shelves, and the dust had begun to settle thick. She pushed open the creaky door, the scent of old wood and cardboard greeting her. Boxes were stacked neatly along the walls, each labeled in Robert's tidy handwriting. Holiday decorations, Linda's school projects, tax records, 1990-2000. Margaret smiled at the memories as she pulled a box toward her, brushing off the dust. She was halfway through rearranging when she noticed something out of place. On the bottom shelf, partially hidden behind an old toolbox, was a slim folder. It didn't look like any of Robert's. The label was scrawled hastily in black ink, Elm Street Development Plans. Her brows knitted together. Carefully, she pulled it out and opened it. Inside were glossy pamphlets and typed proposals for a redevelopment project, several blocks of the neighborhood, including her own street. Most of the documents were standard real estate pitches, but what caught her attention were the handwritten notes in the margins. They were in Greg's handwriting. Phrases leapt out at her. High potential, corner lot. Market peak within 6 months. Must secure property quietly. Margaret's stomach tightened. It wasn't just idle talk. Greg had a plan, and it involved more than casual concern for her comfort. She closed the folder slowly, her fingers resting on the cover. The house was silent around her, but in her chest, her heart pounded. She could almost hear Robert's voice, low and steady, warning her to trust her instincts. Setting the folder aside, she stood in the dim light of the storage room, feeling the weight of what she'd found. For years, she had thought of her home as unshakable, a place no one could touch, but now she could see the storm forming on the horizon. And this time it wasn't the weather, it was her own family. She switched off the light, the folder tucked under her arm. As she stepped back into the main hall, the roses outside brushed softly against the windows, as if whispering their own warning. Margaret paused, glancing toward the garden. "Robert," she murmured under her breath, "it looks like we've got a fight coming." The next morning began like any other. The sunlight filtered softly through the kitchen curtains, the smell of fresh coffee filling the air. Margaret stood at the counter, pouring herself a cup, the familiar rhythm of her day keeping her grounded. The roses outside swayed in the breeze, their petals opening to greet the sun. She was just settling at the table with her newspaper when a sharp knock sounded at the front door. It was firmer than Susan's knock, lacking its warmth. Curious, she set her coffee down and went to answer. On the porch stood a uniformed courier holding a large envelope. Mrs. Hill? Yes. Delivery for you. Needs a signature. Margaret signed without much thought. Packages and letters weren't unusual, but the moment the envelope was in her hand, a chill prickled up her spine. It was heavier than expected, the kind of heaviness that carried bad news. She closed the door, the sound echoing in the quiet house. At the kitchen table, she slid open the seal with her letter opener. A stack of legal papers slid out, each page crisp and official. Her eyes scanned the first line, and the words blurred for a moment before coming into focus. Petition for guardianship, filed by Linda Carter. Margaret froze. Her breath caught in her chest. She read the words again, as if repetition would change them. But the meaning was clear. Her own daughter had filed a lawsuit claiming she was no longer capable of making decisions for herself. The coffee turned bitter in her mouth. A rush of heat spread across her face, then drained, leaving her cold. She kept reading, her hands trembling slightly. The petition stated that Margaret was experiencing cognitive decline and could no longer safely manage her personal and financial affairs. It wasn't just an insult. It was a betrayal, precise, calculated, and signed in ink by the very person she had raised. She sat back in her chair, the papers spread before her. It was as though the floor had shifted beneath her feet. Linda hadn't just come to talk her into selling the house. She had gone to court to take it from her entirely. The grandfather clock ticked loudly in the silence. Margaret's mind felt both numb and sharpened, like ice under pressure. The phone rang, startling her. She reached for it, her voice unsteady. Hello? Margaret. Susan's voice was brisk, but Margaret could hear the underlying concern. I saw a courier at your door. What's going on? There was a long pause before Margaret answered. Linda has filed for guardianship. She says I'm not capable of taking care of myself. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. Oh, Margaret. Susan's tone softened, heavy with disbelief. I'm coming over. Don't move. Within minutes, Susan was at the door, her cardigan half-buttoned, hair slightly windblown. She stepped inside and took one look at the papers on the table. Her jaw tightened. They actually filed it. She picked up the top sheet, scanning the legal jargon. They're claiming you're unfit. This isn't concern, Margaret. This is a move for control. Margaret's hands curled around her teacup, more for something to hold than for comfort. I knew they were circling, but this... She shook her head slowly. It feels like a knife in the back. Susan sat down across from her, her expression firm. Then we treat it like what it is. A fight. You've been underestimated before, Margaret. You didn't build this house by letting people push you around. A faint smile ghosted across Margaret's lips. You always did have a way of making me feel like I could take on the world. You can, Susan replied, her eyes glinting. But you need to be smart. This is legal. It's not enough to just tell the truth. You have to prove it. And I'm going to help you. Margaret looked at her friend, gratitude and weariness mixing in her chest. I don't even know where to start. First, you don't panic, Susan said. Second, you gather proof, medical records, testimony from people who see you every day. And third, her voice softened, you prepare yourself. They're going to make this ugly. Margaret glanced toward the envelope again. I suppose I always hoped Linda's ambition would stop short of this, but I should have known better. Susan reached across the table, placing a hand over hers. Hoping doesn't change people. Action does. And you, my friend, are going to take action. The kitchen felt less like a safe haven now, more like a planning room before battle. The roses outside swayed in the wind, their petals trembling, as if echoing the unease in Margaret's chest. She drew in a deep breath, straightening her shoulders. "All right," she said finally. "If Linda wants a fight over my life, she's going to get one." Susan's lips curved into a knowing smile. "That's the spirit." The lawsuit documents sat neatly stacked on the dining table, but their weight lingered in Margaret's chest. She refused to let them define her. She'd fought her way through harder seasons of life, losing Robert, raising Linda alone, keeping the house in good repair through lean years. This was another fight, and she would prepare for it. Her first step was simple: facts. She dialed the number of Dr. Patterson, her longtime physician, but she wasn't naive enough to assume Linda hadn't tried to influence local doctors. So, she booked an appointment with a neurologist in a neighboring town, someone Greg and Linda wouldn't have connections to. A thorough evaluation, independent and untainted by family politics, would become her shield. Next, she took out a fresh leather-bound journal from the desk drawer. It had been a gift from Robert on her 50th birthday, back when she'd been too busy to fill it. Now, it would serve a new purpose. Every day she would record her schedule in detail, her meals, her garden work, her errands, the names of the people she spoke to, even the books she read. No one could call her life empty or her mind clouded if she had evidence in her own handwriting. Susan stopped by that afternoon to check in. She raised an approving brow at the journal. "Good. Let them try to call you forgetful after reading a week's worth of this." Margaret's lips curled into a thin smile. "They won't catch me off guard, Susan. Not this time." There was still one more piece of the plan: Linda herself. Margaret had learned long ago that people reveal more when they think they're winning. She picked up the phone and called her daughter. "Linda?" Her voice was calm, even warm. "I've been thinking about what you and Greg said. Maybe you're right. This house is a lot for me alone. Perhaps I should consider options." There was a pause on the other end, a silence just long enough for Margaret to imagine Linda's surprise. "Mom, I'm glad you're open to talking about it. Why don't Greg and I come over tomorrow evening? We can go over some possibilities." "Tomorrow will be fine," Margaret said. "Bring whatever information you think I should see." When she hung up, Susan gave her a sideways glance. That was convincing, almost too convincing. Margaret allowed herself a small chuckle. Sometimes the best way to find the truth is to let someone think you're on their side. The next day passed quietly. Margaret spent the morning pruning the roses, letting the rhythmic snip of the shears calm her thoughts. In the afternoon, she reviewed her notes for the upcoming doctor's visit, making sure she had her medical history neatly organized. By early evening, the air outside was heavy with the scent of summer blooms. Margaret set a pitcher of lemonade on the porch table. If they thought they were walking into a victory, she would let them. But when the knock came at the door, it wasn't Linda. Greg stood there alone, a polished smile on his face and a neatly wrapped box in his hands. "Margaret," he said warmly, "Linda's tied up at work, but I thought I'd stop by. I brought you something." Margaret raised a brow, but stepped aside to let him in. "That's thoughtful of you." Greg set the box on the table and opened it, revealing a set of sleek new kitchen knives, each blade gleaming. "High quality. I thought they might make things easier for you in the kitchen. You deserve nice things." Margaret studied him carefully. Greg had always been polite, but never this attentive. "That's generous." He leaned casually against the counter. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about the house. It's beautiful, but there are parts that could be updated. For safety, of course. New railings, maybe a bathroom remodel to make it more accessible. If you'd like, I could arrange some contractors to come by and give estimates. No pressure, just thinking ahead. Margaret gave him a small, non-committal smile. That's kind of you, Greg. I'll think about it. After he left, Susan appeared from the side garden, a suspicious look on her face. What was that snake doing here without Linda? Margaret told her about the knives and the offer to update the house. Susan's eyes narrowed. He's not thinking about safety. He's thinking about getting contractors in here to appraise the place. Once there's a number on paper, it's easier to justify selling. This is about valuation, not renovation. Margaret's jaw tightened. She had suspected as much, but hearing it aloud steeled her resolve. Then we make sure whatever trap they're setting doesn't close on me. She glanced toward the wrapped knives on the table, the steel glinting in the evening light. It was a reminder. Every smile from Greg, every word from Linda came sharpened, meant to cut in ways they thought she wouldn't see coming. But she saw, and she was ready. The following evening, the familiar hum of a silver sedan announced their arrival. Margaret was in the kitchen, arranging a plate of lemon cookies on a porcelain dish Robert had bought her decades ago. The house smelled faintly of vanilla and rosewater, hospitality at its finest. She had prepared everything as if nothing in the world was amiss. When the knock came, she opened the door with a warm smile. Linda, Greg, come in. Linda stepped inside, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She was dressed in another fitted blazer, hair perfectly in place, but her smile was just a little too bright. Greg followed, his eyes scanning the house with the quiet precision of someone assessing more than just the decor. I can't believe how beautiful everything still looks, Mom, Linda said as she set her handbag on the entry table. You've done such a great job keeping the house in shape. Margaret chuckled softly, gesturing them toward the sitting room. When you love something, you take care of it. Tea, cookies? Greg's smile broadened. That sounds perfect. They settled onto the sofa, the afternoon sunlight streaming in through the windows. Linda accepted her tea with a polite nod, Greg taking his cup with the same ease as a man settling into a negotiation. I've been thinking a lot about what you said on the phone, Mom, Linda began, her voice warm, almost cautious. About maybe considering other options. It means a lot to me that you're open to having this conversation. Margaret sipped her tea, letting the silence stretch just enough to make Linda fill it. You know, Linda continued, I've looked into Sunny Pines again. It's really such a wonderful place. They have gardens, activities, even art classes. You wouldn't be alone, and you wouldn't have to worry about all the burdens that come with maintaining this house. Greg nodded along, leaning forward slightly. Linda's right. And honestly, Margaret, the market right now is extraordinary. Houses in this neighborhood are going for record prices. You're sitting on an asset worth far more than when you built it. Margaret tilted her head, feigning mild curiosity. Is that so? Greg's eyes lit up, sensing his chance. Absolutely. I've been following the numbers closely. A comparable house just down the street sold for nearly $900,000. And it wasn't in nearly as good shape as yours. With the right buyer, you could easily break $1 million. That's enough to guarantee you the very best care and still have money left over for whatever you want. Linda interjected, her tone careful. It's not about the money, Mom. It's about you being safe and comfortable. I just want to make sure you're taken care of. Margaret smiled faintly, setting her teacup down. And what would happen to the house after it's sold? Linda hesitated. Well, it would go to someone who appreciates it, of course, or maybe a developer, depending on the offer. It's hard to say until we see who's interested. Greg leaned back slightly, his tone casual, almost rehearsed. Developers love properties like this. Good location, solid structure, plenty of potential. They might renovate, or they might start fresh. Either way, it's a win-win. Margaret gave a small nod, her expression neutral. I see. And you'd handle all of that for me, I assume. Greg smiled again, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. Naturally. I'd make sure the process was smooth, stress-free. You wouldn't have to lift a finger. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of her teacup. It's a generous offer. But tell me, what kind of timeline would something like that take? Selling? Moving? Settling everything? Linda glanced at Greg, then back at her mother. It depends on the buyer, but with the market as hot as it is, maybe just a few months. Greg added quickly, of course, the sooner we move, the better position we'd be in to secure top value. Margaret gave a small hum of acknowledgement, as if she were simply gathering information. But inside, she was cataloging every word, every detail. They spent the next half hour sipping tea and nibbling cookies, the conversation weaving between polite small talk and gentle nudges toward next steps. Linda spoke at length about Sunny Pines, painting it as a kind of retirement paradise. Greg spoke numbers, property values, and the unprecedented demand in the neighborhood. Margaret listened, nodding at all the right times, occasionally asking questions that seemed innocent but steered the conversation back to their plans. By the time they finished their tea, she had a clearer picture of their intentions than ever before. As they stood to leave, Linda gave her a warm hug. I'm so glad we could talk about this openly, Mom. It means the world to me that you're considering it. Greg shook her hand, his grip just a touch too firm. We'll keep in touch about the details. No rush, of course. Margaret walked them to the door, watching as the silver sedan pulled out of the driveway. She stood in the quiet entryway, the echoes of their voices lingering in the air. The sweetness of their visit clung like the aftertaste of overripe fruit, pleasant on the surface, but hiding something rotten beneath. As the silver sedan rolled away, Margaret lingered by the door for a moment, her hand resting lightly on the old brass handle. She could still hear the cadence of their voices in her ears, every word neatly tucked away in her memory. But this time, she wasn't relying on memory alone. Inside the pocket of her cardigan, the small voice recorder she'd slipped into place before their arrival was still running. It had captured every detail, the warm greetings, the talk of Sunny Pines, and Greg's careful breakdown of the house's market potential. She stepped into the kitchen, shut the door firmly, and placed the recorder on the table. With a steady hand, she stopped the recording and rewound it just far enough to hear Greg's voice again. With the right buyer, we're looking at $1.2 million. Developers like Higgins are offering serious money for lots like this. They'd tear the house down, of course, but that's just business. Margaret froze at the name. Higgins. It wasn't a generic mention. It was specific. A developer with an actual plan. She didn't need to look far to find a witness. From the back porch came the sound of light footsteps and the creak of the side gate. A moment later, Susan's head appeared at the screen door, her expression curious. They're gone? They are, Margaret said, gesturing for her to come in. Susan stepped inside, glancing toward the living room as if checking for lingering shadows. I caught a bit of the show from the garden, couldn't hear everything, but I heard Greg say something about a developer. Higgins? Margaret slid the recorder across the table. I've got it all right here, every word. Susan's eyes widened. Margaret, this is gold. In court, a recording like this could show their intentions aren't about your well-being. It's about the property. And with a name like Higgins attached, it's not speculation. It's a plan. Margaret allowed herself a small, tight smile, That's exactly why I let them talk. They can't resist the sound of their own strategy. The two women sat together for a while, reviewing what Susan had overheard and planning how best to protect the evidence. They agreed to keep the recording secure and to start lining up witnesses, people who saw Margaret's independence daily, from the grocery clerk to the librarian. By late evening, Susan headed home, promising to check in the next morning. Margaret cleaned up the tea things, humming softly to herself. She felt steadier now, as if she'd just secured a crucial piece of armor. The roses outside rustled in the night breeze, a gentle, reassuring sound. But the calm didn't last long. Around 9 o'clock, just as she was preparing for bed, a soft knock sounded at the front door. It was too late for Susan, and none of the neighbors would call at this hour without phoning first. Margaret opened the door cautiously, only to find Linda standing there alone, clutching a small gift bag. Her face was carefully arranged into an expression of contrition. "Mom," she began softly, "I know it's late. I didn't want to leave things the way they were earlier. I felt like maybe I pushed too hard." Margaret stepped aside to let her in, her face neutral. "It's fine, Linda. It's been a long day." Linda placed the gift bag on the table. "It's just some of your favorite tea. A peace offering, I guess." Margaret peeked inside, indeed a tin of Earl Grey, the brand she favored. "That's thoughtful." Linda sat down, her hands fidgeting slightly. I want you to know that everything Greg and I are doing is for your benefit. We've already, she hesitated, biting her lip. "We've already made some arrangements in case you decided to go through with it, just to be prepared." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, though her tone stayed calm. "Arrangements?" Linda nodded, choosing her words carefully. There's a preliminary agreement, nothing binding, of course, just an understanding with a potential buyer to lock in the value before the market changes. It's completely normal, Mom. A preliminary agreement, before the guardianship case was even decided. Margaret masked her reaction, simply nodding as Linda rambled on about protecting her interests and making sure she had options. After a few more pleasantries, Linda excused herself, hugging Margaret tightly before stepping back out into the night. The silver sedan didn't return this time. Linda had come alone, on foot from the nearby parking spot. Margaret stood at the window, watching her daughter disappear into the shadows. The gift bag sat on the table, the tin of tea inside suddenly feeling heavier than it should. The recorder was still within arm's reach. Another piece of the puzzle had just fallen into place, and with it, another layer of betrayal. The morning of the hearing broke cool and clear, but Margaret felt a heaviness settle over her shoulders as she dressed. She chose her navy skirt suit, the one she had worn to Robert's memorial service years ago. It was neat, conservative, and carried an air of quiet dignity. Susan arrived promptly at 8, her own attire crisp but understated. "Ready?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "As I'll ever be," Margaret replied, tucking the folder of medical documents into her bag. She had no lawyer, something that worried Susan, but she had the truth, her evidence, and her resolve. The courthouse stood like an old sentinel in the center of town, its red brick walls weathered but solid. Inside, the hallways hummed with quiet anticipation. By the time they stepped into the small courtroom, Linda and Greg were already seated at the plaintiff's table alongside their attorney, a polished man in a charcoal suit with silver hair at his temples. Margaret took her place at the defendant's table, Susan sliding into the row behind her for moral support. The judge entered, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a calm authority that filled the room. This court will now hear the petition for guardianship in the matter of Linda Carter versus Margaret Hill, she announced. Linda's attorney rose smoothly. Your Honor, we appear today out of genuine concern for Mrs. Hill. My client, Linda Carter, has watched her mother, once a vibrant, capable woman, gradually decline in her ability to manage her daily life. Mrs. Hill forgets important tasks, risks her safety, and lives alone in a home far too large and dangerous for her current condition. This petition is not about money or property. It is about ensuring her care and safety. Margaret sat perfectly still, her expression calm. The attorney gestured toward Linda. My client will testify to her mother's condition. Linda stepped forward, her eyes already glistening. She took the witness stand, hands clasped, voice soft and trembling just enough to seem heartfelt. I love my mother, she began. It breaks my heart to see her struggling. She forgets things, like turning off the stove, or she gets confused about dates. I've tried to help, but she refuses. I only want her to be somewhere safe, with people who can take care of her when I can't be there. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her gaze briefly flicking toward Greg, who gave her an encouraging nod. Linda's attorney prompted gently. Have you discussed with her the option of a care facility? Yes, Linda said. Several times, but she refuses to even consider it. I'm afraid if something happens to her alone in that house, I'll never forgive myself. Her voice cracked perfectly on the last sentence, a performance that might have convinced anyone who didn't know her better. The attorney turned to the judge. Your Honor, this is a daughter desperate to ensure her mother's well-being. We ask that the court grant this petition so Mrs. Carter can make the necessary arrangements for her mother's safety. Margaret rose slowly when it was her turn. She approached the stand without haste, her bag of documents in hand. Your Honor, she began, her voice steady. I am not here to argue emotions. I am here to present facts. She pulled out the medical report from the independent neurologist. 2 weeks ago, I underwent a comprehensive cognitive evaluation by Dr. Andrew Patterson of Harrison Medical Center. He is not my regular physician and has no connection to my family. His findings are clear. I have no signs of dementia, cognitive decline, or impaired judgment. In fact, my performance on his tests was above average for my age group. She handed the document to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. The courtroom was quiet, except for the soft rustle of papers. Margaret continued, I am 68 years old, yes. I am widowed, yes, but I maintain my home, my finances, my daily life without assistance. I cook my own meals, I garden, I read, I keep appointments. I am not frail, I am not confused, and I am certainly not incapable of deciding where I will live. She met the judge's gaze directly. This petition is not about my safety. It is about control of my home, which has been in my possession since my husband and I built it brick by brick. I will not be moved against my will under the guise of concern. A murmur rippled through the small crowd of observers. The judge reviewed the medical report, her expression neutral but attentive. The court acknowledges receipt of the independent evaluation. We will take this into consideration as we proceed. Margaret returned to her table, her movements calm but purposeful. Susan gave her a small nod of encouragement from behind. This was just the opening move, but Margaret could already feel the board shifting. The judge leaned back slightly, reviewing the report in her hands before glancing toward the plaintiff's table. Do you have any further evidence before we proceed to witnesses? Linda's attorney hesitated for a moment, then gestured toward the defense side. Your Honor, the defense claims capability. We would like to hear from her supposed supporters directly. Margaret rose again, this time with a quiet confidence. Your Honor, I do have witnesses who can attest to my daily capabilities and state of mind. I'd like to call my first witness, Susan Miller. Susan walked briskly to the stand, her posture straight, voice firm. After being sworn in, she met the attorney's eyes without flinching. I've lived next to Margaret for over 30 years, she said. I see her almost daily. She tends her garden, cooks, reads, manages repairs. She has never once shown confusion about who she is, where she is, or what she's doing. She's as sharp as ever. The attorney tried to probe. Mrs. Miller, could it be that your friendship clouds your judgment? Susan's lips curved in a faint smile. If anything, 30 years of knowing someone strips away illusions. If she were confused, I'd be the first to notice. She isn't. The judge nodded, making a note. Next came Dr. Patterson. His calm, professional manner carried weight in the small courtroom. He confirmed his independent evaluation, detailing the cognitive tests he had administered. Mrs. Hill's results were well within normal limits, above average in certain areas. There is no medical basis for a claim of dementia or incapacity. The judge looked toward Linda's attorney. Cross-examination. The attorney shifted but ultimately declined. Margaret could feel the shift in the room. The air was no longer heavy with assumption. It was thinning, becoming sharper, clearer. She took a steadying breath. Your Honor, I have one more piece of evidence, a recording of a conversation in my home between myself, my daughter, and my son-in-law, Greg Carter. Linda stiffened visibly. Greg's smile faltered for the first time. The judge raised a brow. Was this recording made with your participation, Mrs. Hill? Yes, Your Honor. I was present for the conversation, and the recording device was mine. Then the court will hear it. Margaret pressed play. Greg's voice filled the courtroom, smooth but damning. With the right buyer, we're looking at $1.2 million. Developers like Higgins are offering serious money for lots like this. They'd tear the house down, of course, but that's just business. Linda's voice followed, calm and complicit. We've already got a preliminary agreement. It's better to be ready before Mom decides. The silence that followed was electric. Greg shifted in his seat, adjusting his tie. Linda's face flushed a deep red. The attorney looked as though he'd swallowed something sharp. The judge regarded them both with cool scrutiny. Mr. Carter, Mrs. Carter, is there an explanation for this conversation? Greg opened his mouth, then closed it again. That was just hypothetical discussion, he muttered, but the conviction in his voice was gone. Linda tried to regain footing. Mom, this isn't what it sounds like. We were just... The judge held up a hand. Mrs. Carter, I would caution you against further explanation until advised by your counsel. Margaret sat back, her face calm, but her heart was steady in triumph. The tape had done its work. Just when she thought the momentum was firmly in her favor, the bailiff stepped toward the bench. Your Honor, there is an individual outside claiming to have information relevant to the case. He states he is a business associate of Mr. Greg Carter. The judge's brows lifted slightly. Name? Daniel Reeves, Your Honor. Greg went pale. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, her instinct sensing another turn in the board. The judge considered for a moment, then nodded. We will take a brief recess before hearing from this unexpected witness. Court will reconvene in 15 minutes. The gavel came down sharply. Margaret gathered her papers, her mind already racing. She had never heard of Daniel Reeves, but if he was here now uninvited, then Greg's carefully built facade might be about to crack even wider. And Margaret intended to be ready when it did. When the court reconvened, the air was charged with a tension that clung to every word. Daniel Reeves's testimony turned out to be brief, but decisive. He confirmed that Greg had spoken openly about locking in the Hill property, and boasted that the deal was as good as done. Greg's attorney tried to minimize it, but the damage was clear. Combined with the medical evaluation, the witness testimony, and the damning recording, the balance of the case tipped sharply in Margaret's favor. Judge Harmon took a long moment to review her notes before delivering the ruling. The courtroom fell silent. In the matter of Linda Carter versus Margaret Hill, the judge began, her voice steady. The court finds insufficient evidence to support the claim of incapacity. The petition for guardianship is hereby denied. Mrs. Hill retains full legal authority over her personal and financial affairs. The sound of the gavel striking wood echoed like a release of pressure that had built for weeks. Margaret let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Susan reached forward from the bench behind her, gently squeezing her shoulder in quiet congratulations. Across the aisle, Linda's composure cracked, her lips pressed into a tight line as she stared down at her hands. Beside her, Greg's jaw tightened, his face flushed with frustration. The judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, she continued, the court strongly cautions the petitioners regarding any future actions that might be construed as coercive or financially motivated. This court will not hesitate to revisit the matter should such concerns arise again. Margaret stood slowly, her posture steady, but her heart pounding. She had won, but as she looked toward her daughter, there was no joy in the victory. Linda rose as well, but her gaze did not meet her mother's. Instead, she busied herself with collecting her bag, avoiding eye contact. Greg muttered something under his breath as they prepared to leave, his carefully maintained charm nowhere to be seen. As they exited the courtroom, the sound of the door closing behind them was heavy, final in a way Margaret hadn't expected. Susan leaned closer. "You did it. You kept your home. You proved them wrong." Margaret nodded faintly, but her expression was distant. "Yes, but at what cost?" The two women walked slowly out of the courthouse. The autumn sunlight was warm, the air crisp, but Margaret felt none of it. Her mind was still back in the courtroom, seeing the look in Linda's eyes, or rather the lack of it. Winning the case meant keeping her independence, her house, her life as she knew it. But it also meant acknowledging something she had resisted for a long time. The fracture in her relationship with her daughter might never heal. Back at the house, the familiar scent of roses greeted her as she stepped onto the porch. She unlocked the front door, pausing for just a moment before entering. Inside, everything was just as she had left it. The sunlight streaming through the windows illuminated the worn wooden floors, the shelves lined with books, the photos of Robert and Linda through the years. Margaret set her bag down on the hall table and moved slowly through the rooms, touching the back of a chair here, adjusting a frame there. She had fought to protect this house, and she had succeeded, but the victory felt strangely hollow. Susan followed her inside, her voice gentle. "It's natural to feel conflicted, Margaret. You've just been through a battle. Winning doesn't erase the wounds." Margaret gave a soft sigh. "She's still my daughter, Susan, no matter what she's done." "And you're still her mother," Susan replied. "But you can't change her choices. You can only live your life." Margaret looked toward the garden, where the roses swayed in the late afternoon breeze. "I will. I just thought maybe the fight would mean something different at the end, that she'd understand." Susan didn't answer right away. Sometimes people only understand when they lose something they can't get back. Maybe that time hasn't come for her yet. Margaret let the thought settle, then moved toward the kitchen. Tea? Susan smiled faintly. Always. They sat together, sipping in companionable silence. The house felt safe again, but quieter, emptier in a way that had nothing to do with the number of people in it. Margaret knew she had defended her home, her independence, her right to live on her own terms. But she also knew that some battles left marks you couldn't see. As the evening light faded, she walked Susan to the door. "Thank you for everything, Susan. I couldn't have done this without you." Her friend squeezed her hand. "You'd have done it, Margaret. You just wouldn't have had someone to remind you you're not alone." When Susan left, Margaret stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the sun sink low over the neighborhood. The roses caught the last golden light, their petals glowing. She had won. But as she turned back into the quiet house, she felt the weight of the victory settle deep in her chest. The next morning, sunlight spilled softly across the kitchen table, catching the steam rising from Margaret's teacup. The house was quiet, the kind of peaceful quiet she had fought so hard to preserve. She sat in her favorite chair, a blanket draped across her knees, staring out at the roses Robert had planted so many years ago. Susan arrived mid-morning, letting herself in with the familiar knock. She carried a basket of fresh muffins, the smell of cinnamon filling the air. "Well," she said, setting the basket down, "I hope you've had a moment to let it sink in. You did it, Margaret. You kept your home. You kept your life." Margaret smiled faintly, though her eyes were thoughtful. "Yes, I kept the house, but I keep wondering if I lost something else in the process." Susan pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "You didn't lose your dignity. You didn't lose your sense of self. Those are worth more than any property, and as for Linda," she paused, choosing her words carefully. "Some relationships can't be saved in the middle of a storm. Sometimes they need distance and time." Margaret sighed, her fingers curling around her teacup. "I just can't stop thinking about how certain she looked, as if she was doing me a favor." Susan's expression softened. "People tell themselves all kinds of stories to justify what they want. You've seen it enough to know that. The important thing is, you weren't fooled. You stood your ground." Margaret looked out the window again, watching a light breeze sway the roses. "Maybe one day she'll see it differently, but I'm not holding my breath." They spent the rest of the morning in easy conversation, talking about the church fair, the state of the neighborhood, and a new book Susan wanted to lend her. For a little while, life felt normal again. It wasn't until late afternoon that the quiet was broken by the sound of a car pulling up outside. Margaret didn't recognize the vehicle, not the polished silver sedan she had come to associate with Greg and Linda, but a different, darker model. Moments later, there was a knock at the door. When Margaret opened it, she was startled to see Linda standing there alone, her hair slightly disheveled, her expression tense. "Mom," Linda began, her voice quieter than Margaret remembered. I know I'm probably the last person you want to see right now." Margaret stood still for a moment, then stepped back to let her in. "Come inside, Linda. You look troubled." Linda entered, glancing briefly around the familiar rooms as if unsure she still belonged there. She set her purse on the table but didn't sit. "I wouldn't be here if it weren't important," she admitted, starting. "It's Greg. There was a deal he was working on." Margaret's expression didn't change, but her mind was already piecing things together. Linda swallowed hard. It was the Higgins deal, the one he was counting on, The buyer, they backed out. Greg had already put down money to secure some of the arrangements, and now, Margaret's tone was calm but firm. Now he's lost it. Linda's shoulders slumped. Yes, everything. And we're in trouble, Mom. Greg he really thought this was going to be the one to set us up. Susan, who had been quietly listening from the kitchen doorway, crossed her arms. You mean the one where you sell your mother's house out from under her? That deal? Linda winced, but didn't argue. I know how it sounds. I know what I've done, but I didn't think it would come to this. We need help. Margaret studied her daughter for a long moment. Linda's voice wasn't as polished as usual. There was no rehearsed charm, no careful performance, just desperation. You came here, Margaret said slowly, because you think I'll bail you out. Linda's eyes flickered. I came here because I didn't know where else to go. The words hung in the air. Margaret looked toward Susan, who gave the smallest shake of her head, as if to say, be careful. Margaret's gaze returned to her daughter. Linda, I will always be your mother, but you need to understand something very clearly. My home, my life, they are not safety nets for Greg's schemes. Whatever trouble he's in now, it's his to face. Linda's lips parted as if to protest, but she stopped herself. Instead, she nodded faintly, her face pale. Margaret's voice softened, but only slightly. You came here asking for help. I'm not going to turn you away from my door, but help doesn't always mean money. Sometimes it means telling the truth. Maybe you should start with yourself. Linda looked down, her shoulders sagging further. For the first time in years, she seemed smaller, less the polished professional, more the daughter Margaret remembered. I don't know if I can fix this, Linda admitted. Then perhaps it's time to stop letting Greg make your choices for you, Margaret replied gently. Linda left not long after, quieter than when she had arrived. As the door closed behind her, Margaret stood for a long moment in the entryway, feeling the weight of what had just passed. Susan stepped forward. You handled that well. You didn't shut her out, but you didn't let her pull you under either. Margaret gave a tired smile. Maybe that's the best I can do for now. The days after Linda's unexpected visit passed quietly, but there was a change in the air that Margaret couldn't quite name. She kept to her usual routines, tending the roses, keeping the house in order, but her mind wandered often. It was late on a Thursday afternoon when she heard another knock at the door. Her first thought was Susan, but when she opened it, Linda stood there again. This time, there was no polished outfit, no carefully controlled smile. Linda's shoulders were slightly hunched, her eyes tired. She held a paper bag in her hands, the kind from the bakery down the street. Mom, she said softly, I brought you some of those apple turnovers you like. Margaret stepped aside to let her in, her voice even. Come in, Linda. They sat at the kitchen table. Linda set the bag down but didn't reach for the food. Her hands rested on the table, fingers laced together. I wanted to say, she hesitated, her voice unsteady. I wanted to say, I'm sorry. I know I've said things before to justify what I was doing, but the truth is, I wasn't thinking about you the way I should have. I thought I was being practical, but I was really just thinking about other things. Margaret studied her daughter quietly, the ache in her chest deepening. Other things meaning Greg, the deals, the money. Linda looked down, shame flickering across her face. Yes, I thought if I could make the numbers work, then everything would be okay. But I didn't stop to think about what it would cost. Margaret's hands tightened slightly around her teacup. She had dreamed of hearing her daughter apologize, but the reality felt different, heavier somehow. "You hurt me, Linda," she said quietly. "Not just with the lawsuit, but with the way you looked at this house, as if it was just wood and land. This home is my life. It's part of you, too, even if you don't want to see it." Linda's eyes shimmered. "I know. I see it now. And I'm sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I want you to know that I'm done with Greg's plans. I need to start over." Margaret's heart twisted. She wanted to protect her daughter, but she also wanted her to understand that actions had consequences. Starting over is never easy, Linda, but it's the only way forward sometimes. They sat in silence for a moment, the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the air. Margaret could feel the old instinct tugging at her, to comfort, to reassure. But she also knew she had to keep boundaries in place. Before she could say more, the phone rang. Margaret stood to answer, grateful for the momentary pause. "Hello? Grandma?" The voice on the other end was warm, familiar. Margaret smiled despite herself. "Ethan? What a surprise." Ethan Carter, her grandson, Linda's son, had been away at school on the West Coast. They spoke now and then, but mostly through holiday calls and the occasional birthday greeting. "I just got accepted to transfer to Franklin University," Ethan said, excitement clear in his voice. "It's only about 30 miles from you. I was wondering if you might have space for me to stay. Dorms are expensive, and I'd love to be closer to family." Margaret's heart lifted in a way she hadn't expected. "Of course, Ethan. You'd be more than welcome here. We can fix up the east bedroom. It used to be your mom's." Ethan laughed lightly. "The one with the window facing the sunrise? She used to tell me about that. I'd love that room." Margaret glanced at Linda, who looked startled but said nothing. "When will you be arriving?" Margaret asked. "Classes start in 2 weeks," Ethan said. "I'll probably drive up next Friday if that works for you. I don't have a lot of stuff, just clothes, books, my laptop." "That's perfect," Margaret replied warmly. "I'll make sure everything's ready." After they hung up, she stood for a moment holding the receiver, her mind already turning to preparations. The east bedroom hadn't been used in years, but the thought of life returning to it brought an unexpected lightness to her heart. Linda spoke softly. "He's moving here." Margaret turned back toward her daughter. "Yes, he'll be close by for school. Maybe it will be good for both of us. A fresh start." Linda nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. Margaret felt a mixture of emotions. Pain from the wounds her daughter had inflicted, pride in her grandson's independence, and a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, family could still mean something more than property and arguments. As evening fell, Linda stood to leave. "Thank you for listening, Mom. I'll try to do better." Margaret watched her go, unsure of what the future held, but certain that she would face it with the same resolve that had carried her through everything so far. And now with Ethan coming, the house would no longer be quite so quiet. The week before Ethan's arrival was the busiest Margaret had felt in a long time. The east bedroom, untouched for years, became her focus. She pulled back the curtains, letting the dust dance in the sunlight before sweeping it away. The air filled with the scent of lemon polish and freshly laundered linens. Susan came by one afternoon to help. Together they moved boxes, sorted through old belongings, and aired out the mattress. "You're glowing, Margaret," Susan said, fluffing a pillow. "It's good to see you have some excitement in the house again." Margaret smiled faintly, adjusting the curtains. "It's been quiet for too long. I'm looking forward to the noise of someone young under this roof again. By the time Friday came, the room was ready. The window facing east caught the morning light, just as it had when Linda was a child. The thought made Margaret pause, her chest tightening with both nostalgia and hope. Ethan arrived that afternoon, his car pulling into the driveway with the cautious energy of someone stepping into a new chapter. He climbed out, taller than she remembered, his frame lean but strong, his eyes bright. "Grandma," he called, his smile genuine. Margaret met him halfway, embracing him warmly. "Ethan, you've grown." "That happens when you feed us," he teased lightly, before glancing toward the house. "This place looks just like I remember it." They carried his few belongings inside, 2 suitcases, a box of books, and a worn leather backpack. When they reached the east bedroom, Ethan stopped in the doorway, taking in the sunlight spilling across the bedspread. "It's perfect," he said, setting his bags down. "You didn't have to do all this." Margaret smiled. "Of course I did. This room has been waiting for you." Over the next few days, the house came alive in ways Margaret hadn't realized she missed. Ethan cooked simple meals, helped carry groceries, and asked questions about the garden. In the evenings, they'd sit on the porch drinking tea, the quiet hum of summer nights wrapping around them. One evening, as they watched the last light fade, Ethan shifted in his chair. "Grandma, there's something I should tell you." Margaret turned toward him, curious. "What is it?" He hesitated, glancing toward the roses before meeting her gaze. "When I asked to live here, it wasn't just about saving money on dorms. I wanted to learn from you, not just about life, but about architecture, the way you and Grandpa built this house. I've seen the blueprints you showed me when I was younger, and it inspired me." Margaret's brow lifted slightly, touched by his sincerity. "That's a fine reason, Ethan, but I sense there's more." Ethan exhaled. "There is. I also want to write something. A book, maybe. About you, about the house, about what happened. People don't always understand what really goes on when families fight over things like this. They only hear rumors. I want to tell the truth. Your truth. Not to shame anyone, but to set the record straight." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, the weight of his words settling over her. "That's a big responsibility, Ethan. Why would you want to take that on?" He met her eyes without flinching. "Because your story matters. Because people should know what it means to stand your ground. And because you've been my grandmother all my life. But I feel like I'm only now starting to really know you. I want others to know you, too." Her heart swelled, a mix of pride and something deeper. Relief, perhaps. For so long, she had felt like she was guarding the story of her life alone. Now, here was someone willing to carry it forward. "You have a good heart," she said softly. "If you want to tell my story, I'll help you. But you must promise to tell it honestly. The good and the bad." "I promise," Ethan said. They sat in comfortable silence after that, watching the garden as the sky turned shades of orange and purple. The roses glowed faintly in the fading light, their blooms heavy and full. Margaret's thoughts drifted to the battles she had fought, not just in the courtroom, but over years of holding her home, her dignity, and her memories together. She realized then that she had protected more than a house. She had protected the story of her life, the foundation of her family's history. And now that story wouldn't end with her. As evening settled fully, she looked at Ethan and smiled. "Let's go inside. We've got a lot to talk about, and a lot of history to cover." From the porch, she glanced one last time at the garden. The roses swayed gently, as if in agreement. She had kept her home. She had defended her truth, and now she was passing it on.